As a seasoned traveler and forest ranger, I've come to understand the beauty and danger that exists within nature. My life has been a tapestry woven with the threads of exploration, survival, and discovery. But there is one journey, one place, that forever changed me and reminded me that some mysteries are better left unsolved. This is the story of my ill-fated expedition to a remote and dangerous mountain in Alaska, an experience that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had worked as a forest ranger for over a decade by the time I was sent to Alaska. Over the years, I had learned to navigate the treacherous landscapes, respected the wildlife, and remained vigilant about the hidden dangers lurking in the wilderness. But nothing in my training or past experiences could have prepared me for what I would face on that mountain. The mountain in question was located deep within the Alaskan wilderness, a place so remote that only a handful of people ever ventured there. It had a name known only to locals, the Warden's Keep. The name was as ominous as it sounded, and it carried with it a dark history. Rumors of strange lights flickering on the mountainside, eerie noises echoing through the night, and a strange series of disappearances that had occurred over the decades. These were not the kind of stories you'd hear around a campfire. They were real, tragic, and unexplained. Despite the warnings, I thought it would be an adventure worth undertaking. I had been assigned to investigate the area due to a series of strange reports. A research group had gone missing during an expedition, and no trace of them had been found. The local authorities were stumped, and so the federal government sent me in, a ranger with experience in both tracking and survival. I wasn't naive enough to think there were supernatural forces at play, but I was cautious. There was always a logical explanation: wildlife, weather, or the harsh environment. Still, the stories from the locals and my own feelings of unease tugged at my gut. I set out with my trusted companion Max, a German shepherd who had been my partner on countless expeditions. Max was more than just a dog. He was my eyes and ears, a companion who understood the wilderness as much as I did. We made our way to the trailhead, loaded with gear and ready to face whatever came our way. The air was bitterly cold, the wind sharp, and the snow crunched beneath our boots as we moved forward into the dense forest that cloaked the base of the mountain. The first few days were uneventful. We followed the trail markers, noting the lack of animal tracks and the eerily quiet surroundings. The deeper we ventured into the wilderness, the more isolated we became. There was no sound of birds, no rustle of squirrels, nothing but the wind and the steady crunch of snow beneath our feet. Even Max, usually a ball of energy, was unnervingly quiet. It felt as if we were being watched, though I couldn't see anything, and I convinced myself it was just the vastness of the place playing tricks on my mind. On the third day, the mountain loomed large before us, its peak hidden in thick clouds. We set up camp just below the tree line, a strategic location that offered some shelter from the wind. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further, and the quiet became unbearable. It was then that the first strange occurrence took place. Max, who had been sleeping soundly by the fire, suddenly jumped to his feet and began barking into the darkness. His fur bristled, and his ears were fully alert. I called to him, but he didn't respond. His barking grew more frantic as he paced in tight circles around the camp. I grabbed my rifle, scanning the dark forest around us, but saw nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the unnerving silence of the wilderness. The only thing I could make out were the distant shadows of trees swaying in the wind. Max's barking became more desperate, and for the first time in my life, I felt an unsettling sense of dread wash over me. Something was wrong. I tried to calm him down, but Max was insistent. He refused to leave the campfire's light and kept his gaze fixed on the darkness. His behavior was out of character, and it felt as though something was lurking in the shadows just out of sight. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Eventually, Max calmed down, though the unease lingered. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion, thinking that perhaps the isolation was beginning to affect both of us. But that night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard something that changed everything. A sound, low, guttural, almost like a growl, came from somewhere beyond the camp. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it was too quiet, too distant. The wind was howling, and the trees creaked under the pressure, making it impossible to discern what was real and what was just the landscape playing tricks on my senses. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight, aimed it toward the source of the sound, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move, something large and dark just beyond the tree line. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling in my chest remained. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, eyes darting to the shadows around our camp, gripping my rifle tightly. Whatever was out there was not a part of the natural world I had grown to understand. It was something far darker. The next morning, I packed up our camp and began heading further up the mountain. But the fear lingered, tightening around my chest with every step. I knew something was waiting for me up there, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for it. As the days went on, I found myself becoming more and more attuned to the chilling atmosphere of the mountain. What had started as a routine expedition began to feel like something far more sinister, as if the very land itself had turned against us. The wilderness around Mount Rainier, with its towering trees and jagged peaks, was once a place of wonder, a realm I understood intimately as a forest ranger. But the longer we stayed, the more I realized that this was no ordinary forest. It was a living entity, ancient and untouched, with secrets buried deep beneath its roots. Max, my trusted German shepherd, was growing increasingly agitated as well. He would growl at the slightest sound, hackles raised even in the absence of any visible threat. His behavior mirrored my own discomfort. It was as though we were both sensing the same oppressive weight in the air, an invisible presence that seemed to follow our every move. The peaceful silence of nature had turned into something ominous, and even the wind, which once carried the sense of pine and earth, now felt like a cold whisper of something unseen. I had been to many isolated places in my career as a ranger, but none of them had made me feel as exposed as I did now. The mountain, towering above us, seemed alive with an ancient energy. The heavy mist that swirled around the peak, the darkening clouds that never parted, these weren't just atmospheric conditions. It was as though the weather itself was working in concert with something much darker, something beyond human understanding. I had heard stories from fellow rangers about strange occurrences in the Alaskan wilderness, but I had always dismissed them as exaggerations or the product of overactive imaginations. But now, those tales seemed to take on a terrifying weight, as though they were prophecies written long ago. There were whispers of strange lights seen flickering in the forest, of distant cries echoing through the mountain ranges in the dead of night, and of people who had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never recovered. The thought that I was now part of that grim legacy made my blood run cold. But it wasn't just the stories that haunted me, it was the mountain itself. It was as though the land had a mind of its own, and we were intruders in its domain. I had seen animals in the forest before, heard the calls of birds overhead, but here, in this forsaken place, there was an eerie absence of life. Not a single animal track marred the snow, not a bird's song broke the silence. The stillness was oppressive, suffocating. It was as if all the creatures of the forest had vanished, leaving behind only the cold, the wind, and the unrelenting weight of something terrible. Max's behavior had grown even more erratic as we ascended the mountain. He refused to venture into certain areas of the forest, his paws skittering across the ground as if he were sensing something I couldn't see. At night, he would bark at shadows in the trees, his eyes wide with fear. I had learned over the years to trust Max's instincts. They were sharper than my own. But now, I wasn't sure whether I was witnessing true fear or the manifestation of my own growing paranoia. Either way, I knew something was wrong. Despite the creeping sense of dread, I pressed on, driven by a sense of duty to find the missing research team and uncover the truth behind their disappearance. They had been professionals, experienced in the ways of the wild, and yet they had vanished without a trace. It didn't make sense. The most dangerous creatures in the area, bears, wolves, even mountain lions, left behind tracks, evidence of their presence. But there was nothing here, only an eerie silence that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Max and I climbed higher, the terrain growing steeper as we made our way toward the heart of the mountain. The wind howled, biting into our skin, and the clouds above darkened, casting everything in a muted gray light. The snow was deeper here, the trees thicker, their gnarled roots clutching at the earth like the fingers of ancient, forgotten giants. It was beautiful in a haunting way, but it also felt like the end of the world. I had been trained to read the signs of the wild, to understand the language of the earth and the creatures that inhabited it. But nothing in my training had prepared me for this. There were no tracks, no signs of life, only the oppressive stillness of a place that seemed to hold its breath. And yet, the longer we stayed, the more I became convinced that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was on the 5th day, after we had set up camp near the base of the mountain's highest peak, that the real terror began. The wind had picked up, howling like a pack of wolves in the distance, and the snow began to fall harder, obscuring our vision. Max was restless, pacing around the camp, growling under his breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. That night, as I lay awake in my tent, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate, but unmistakable. My heart raced, and I grabbed for my rifle, my eyes scanning the edge of the camp. There was no sign of movement, nothing but the swirling snow and the distant howling of the wind. But the footsteps continued, closer now, as though they were circling us. Max's growls grew louder, more frantic. He was trying to protect me, but from what, I wasn't sure. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I knew something was out there, something that I couldn't see, but I could feel its presence. Something ancient, something that had lived in this mountain long before we ever dared to step foot here. As I lay there, paralyzed by fear, I realized that the legends of this place were not mere stories. They were warnings passed down through generations of things that should never be disturbed. And now, I had made the mistake of entering their domain. The next morning, I would learn just how dangerous that mistake truly was. But that was still ahead of me. For now, I was left with the heavy weight of anticipation and dread, knowing that the true horror of the mountain was closing in on us, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The following morning, as I opened the flap of my tent, the air hit me like a slap. It was colder than the day before, and the winds had intensified, as if the mountain itself was beginning to stir. The horizon was covered by thick, dark clouds, the sky a heavy gray blanket that seemed to press down on us with a crushing weight. I looked around, my eyes scanning the perimeter of the camp, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The footsteps from the previous night had vanished without a trace, and the snow that had fallen since seemed to have swallowed any evidence that they had ever existed. Max was on edge again, his hackles raised as he paced around the camp. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching nervously. Something was definitely wrong. I could feel it in my bones, but there was no sign of immediate danger. It was as if whatever had been circling us the night before had simply vanished, leaving behind only the haunting remnants of its presence. I gathered my gear and began to pack up, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. The morning seemed deceptively peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every gust of wind, felt like a prelude to something terrible. Max's behavior was becoming more erratic by the hour. He was constantly sniffing the ground, growling low in his throat, and his eyes darted to every shadow. I had worked with him long enough to know that he wasn't reacting to the ordinary sounds of nature. There was something else out there, something that he couldn't explain but was sensing all the same. After a quick breakfast of freeze-dried rations, I decided it was time to head out. We needed to press forward, no matter how unsettling the situation had become. I had a duty to complete the mission, and I wasn't going to let fear, or whatever invisible force was lurking in the mountain, stop me from finding the missing researchers. The terrain had become more treacherous as we climbed higher, the snow thickening and the wind cutting through our clothing like 1,000 tiny knives. Max stayed close, his eyes constantly darting around, never settling on one thing for too long. It was as though the entire forest had become an enemy, every tree, every rock, a potential hiding place for whatever force had turned this mountain into a death trap. The further we ventured, the more I realized that something was horribly wrong with this place. There were no animal tracks, no signs of life at all. The forest, which should have been teeming with birds, squirrels, or even the occasional fox, was utterly silent. Not even the wind seemed to carry the sounds of nature. It was as if the entire ecosystem had vanished, leaving only the mountain's desolate core behind. After several hours of climbing, we reached a small clearing. I stopped to rest, allowing Max to drink from the stream that ran through the middle of the area. The water was cold and clear, but there was something unsettling about it. The air around the stream felt charged, like the entire atmosphere was holding its breath. I glanced up at the trees surrounding the clearing and saw that they were unusually twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like gnarled fingers. The snow-covered ground was devoid of footprints, and a thick fog was beginning to roll in, adding to the sense of isolation that seemed to permeate the entire mountain. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being suffocated by the mountain itself. The mist was thickening rapidly, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The temperature was dropping fast, and the biting cold seemed to seep into my bones. As I looked around, I noticed something strange. In the distance, partially obscured by the fog, was what appeared to be a structure, an old, weathered cabin or shack of some kind. It was barely visible, the wood dark and rotting, its windows obscured by grime and years of neglect. Curiosity gnawed at me. I had no memory of any recorded structures in this part of the mountain, and it seemed odd that such a building would be so far off the beaten path. Yet something inside me told me that this cabin held answers that would explain the strange disappearances and the unnerving silence that now surrounded us. Max's low growl interrupted my thoughts. He had his nose to the ground, sniffing furiously, his tail stiff with tension. I knew something was amiss. "I know, boy," I muttered, tightening my grip on my rifle. "Something's out there." We started moving toward the cabin, the fog swirling around us like a living thing, disorienting me with its density. The deeper we ventured into the mist, the more I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on us. It wasn't just the physical isolation, it was the psychic weight, the sense that we were not meant to be here, that this land was a forbidden place, cursed even. As we drew closer to the cabin, I began to hear sounds, soft, almost imperceptible noises that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the sound of something moving within the cabin, something that shouldn't have been there. A creaking of floorboards, the unmistakable scratch of nails against wood. Max's growl grew louder, his body tense with anticipation, and my heart pounded in my chest. We were close now, too close, and I felt the oppressive weight of whatever was inside the cabin bearing down on us. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the earth beneath me. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air searing my lungs. And then, in the midst of the silence, a figure appeared in the fog. A man, pale, gaunt, his face streaked with dirt. His eyes were wide with terror, his body shaking uncontrollably. "Help me," he whispered hoarsely. "Get out of here. They're coming." Before I could speak, he collapsed at my feet, and the mountain seemed to roar in response, the wind picking up into a violent shriek. Something in the mist moved, something large, something ancient. I knew then, with a sickening certainty, that we had reached the heart of the terror. The terror that had begun to take shape on Mount Rainier was not a simple tale of survival against an unknown force. No, there were deeper layers to the nightmare, threads of mystery that stretched beyond the immediate danger of the strange creature hunting us. As I stood there, looking down at the collapsed man at my feet, I knew that I was only just beginning to understand the full complexity of the situation. The fog, thick and all-encompassing, was not just a physical barrier. It seemed to cloud my thoughts as well, warping the perception of time and space. It wasn't just the mountain that was alive, I realized, but something far more insidious, a force that had been waiting for years, perhaps even centuries, for someone like me to come. Max was still growling, his attention fully focused on the figure now lying motionless in the snow. The man's sudden appearance had sent a jolt of fear through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of something much bigger than the missing researchers I had come to find. Who was he? And why had he been so desperate to warn me? Was he simply another victim of the mountain's curse, or was there something more to his story? As I knelt beside the man, trying to assess his condition, I noticed his clothing was unlike anything I would expect from a typical outdoorsman. It was worn and frayed, yet oddly clean in some places, as though he had been in the wild for a long time, but had not experienced the same hardships I had. I tried to rouse him, shaking his shoulder gently, but he didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and his eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of terror. The kind of terror that no one should ever have to experience. In the distance, the cabin loomed ominously, its dark silhouette barely visible through the fog. The man had been heading toward it, I realized, but why? Was there something inside it that had driven him to madness, or had the very air around the mountain twisted his mind? It wasn't until I noticed the bloodstains on the man's hands and the deep gouges on his arms that the true horror of his situation began to sink in. These weren't the marks of someone who had been attacked by an animal. No, these were the wounds of something else, something human, something more malicious. The blood was still wet, and I wondered if it was his, or if he had stumbled across something else, something far worse than any wild animal. The man's lips parted suddenly, and a barely audible whisper escaped. "It's here, it's always here." His voice was ragged, as if the words were dragged from him by force. They were. But before he could finish, his eyes rolled back into his head, and his body went limp in my arms. I froze, uncertainty crashing over me like a tidal wave. Who were they? And what had he been trying to say before he died? What had driven him to such an unstable state? And was I in immediate danger of suffering the same fate? I knew I couldn't afford to dwell on these questions for long. I had a job to do, a mission to complete, but the weight of the situation was beginning to feel overwhelming. Not only did I have to find the missing researchers, but now I had to unravel the mystery of what had happened to this man, and more importantly, what had happened to the others who had come before me. The fog, now thicker than ever, seemed to swirl around us like a living thing. As I stood up, clutching the rifle tightly in my hands, I couldn't help but feel that this mountain was far more than just an isolated wilderness. It was a place where the very boundaries of reality seemed to stretch and break, a place where the rules of nature didn't apply. This wasn't just a hunt anymore, it was a battle for my very sanity. Max was still on high alert, his ears flicking at every sound, his body tense with a mix of fear and instinct. I could feel his unease, and I knew it wasn't just because of the strange man who had collapsed before us. There was something else, something far more dangerous, lurking in the fog, just beyond our reach. Whatever had claimed the lives of the researchers before me, whatever had driven this man to madness, was still out there, watching, waiting. As I took a step forward, my thoughts drifted back to the cabin. I had to go there. I had to confront whatever evil lay hidden in the depths of the mountain, whatever malevolent force had brought this place to life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was more than just a structure. It was a symbol, a place where the darkness had manifested, a focal point of all the terror that had been building up over the years. But there was something else nagging at me, something that had been tugging at the back of my mind ever since I'd arrived at Mount Rainier. The disappearance of the researchers, the strange reports of encounters with something unnatural. It all pointed to something larger, something beyond what I had originally thought. This wasn't just a creature stalking the wilds. It was a force that had been shaping the landscape, bending it to its will, distorting reality itself. The air around me seemed to grow heavier as I approached the cabin. It was as though the mountain itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with an ancient and malevolent energy. I could almost feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me with its weight. Max's growl cut through the thick silence, and I paused, my hand gripping the rifle tighter. Whatever had taken hold of this place, whatever had caused the death of the researchers, was waiting for me. I wasn't just hunting a creature anymore. I was hunting a nightmare. And the closer I got, the more I realized that this wasn't a mission I would survive unscathed. I had to make a decision, to press forward and face whatever awaited me in the darkness, or to turn back and risk never knowing the truth. There was no easy answer, no safe option, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone. And whatever was out there, whatever force had claimed this mountain, was waiting for me. The fog had thickened even further, shrouding the landscape in a near impenetrable veil. I could barely see beyond the edge of my boots, the world reduced to vague shapes and shadows. My senses were heightened, every rustle of wind in the trees or crack of a distant branch sending my heart racing. Something was out there, something watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the deep sense of dread that had been gnawing at me since I arrived at Mount Rainier now surged like a tidal wave. It was no longer just a feeling. It was real. Max was restless, pacing in tight circles around me, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the air. His growls were low and continuous, as if he was sensing something I couldn't yet comprehend. I had seen the signs before, his body language, his instinctive alertness when he felt danger. And right now, he was more agitated than I had ever seen him. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with a presence that felt unnatural. My grip on the rifle tightened, and I forced myself to focus. There was no turning back now. We had to keep moving. The faint outline of the cabin had become clearer through the mist, the decaying wooden structure standing in stark contrast to the rugged wilderness that surrounded it. It was a relic, forgotten by time, but it had a strange power about it. It called to me in ways I didn't understand. I knew I had to reach it, but I also felt the pull of something deeper, something darker in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a cabin. It was the heart of the terror that had plagued this mountain for years. And I was about to step right into its lair. As I moved forward, Max hesitated. He stared into the dense fog, his posture tense. Something was out there, something that was causing him to second-guess our every step. I called to him softly, but he wouldn't budge. It wasn't like him to freeze like this, not when there was a job to be done. My gut told me we were on the edge of something big. And just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard it. A low, guttural growl from deep within the fog. Max's first stood on end. He whipped around, his eyes wide, scanning the mist. His growls turned into frantic barks, echoing in the stillness. My heart leapt in my chest as the sound grew louder, closer. I turned to face the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Just thick, swirling fog. I couldn't see a foot in front of me. I gripped the rifle tighter, stepping back, my heart pounding. It wasn't the growl that had sent me into panic. It was the unmistakable feeling that whatever was out there was aware of me. It knew I was here, knew my every move. And the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. I wasn't the hunter. I was the hunted. Max bolted, tearing off into the fog with a speed I had never seen in him before. I called after him, my voice breaking the silence, but he didn't return. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just a wild animal we were up against. It was something that had driven him into a frenzy, something more dangerous, more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. I turned to run after him, but the fog seemed to close in around me, swallowing everything. The air was thick with tension, with something ancient and malevolent. I had crossed a threshold, and now there was no turning back. Suddenly, a shadow moved within the mist. A figure. For a split second, I thought it was Max, until I saw it clearly. It wasn't Max. It wasn't even human. The creature was massive, its form indistinct but hulking, with long, spindly limbs that stretched and bent in unnatural ways. Its skin was mottled dark and slick, like the hide of some grotesque amphibian. Its eyes, gleaming yellow and soulless, locked onto mine with an intelligence that froze me to the spot. It tilted its head as if studying me, its jaw opening and closing with a sickening wet snap. I couldn't move. My breath came in short gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. My mind screamed at me to run, to shoot, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear, caught in its gaze, unable to look away. Then, without warning, it lunged. I barely had time to react. The creature's movements were lightning fast, faster than anything I could have expected. I fired the rifle, the deafening sound of the gunshot splitting the air, but the creature was already on top of me, its claws sinking into my jacket, dragging me into the air. I screamed, thrashing wildly, but the creature's grip was unyielding. Its rancid breath, like a mixture of decay and rot, hit my face as it pulled me closer, its jagged teeth gnashing in front of my eyes. I fired again, but it was too late. My vision blurred, and everything around me faded to black. Then a sharp snap, a sickening crack. The creature let go, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. I opened my eyes to see Max, bloodied and panting, standing over me, his eyes locked on the creature with an unflinching resolve. The creature hesitated, as if confused by the dog's sudden defiance. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. The battle was no longer just between me and the creature. It was a fight for survival, a fight against something that had no business existing in this world. Max snarled, his teeth bared, and the creature roared in response, shaking the ground beneath us. The fog seemed to part as the two forces faced off, locked in a primal, ancient struggle. And as I lay there, helpless, I realized that this was it, the moment where everything would be decided. The creature would either kill us, or we would escape. But I knew one thing for sure. We weren't leaving the mountain the same. The ground shook beneath me as the creature and Max locked eyes, an unspoken tension swirling in the cold air. My body was still trembling, my mind a blur from the violent encounter, but I could barely tear my eyes away from the terrifying scene unfolding before me. Max, bloodied and bruised, stood his ground against the creature, his eyes fixed in a primal, furious stare, while the creature itself, monstrous and otherworldly, seemed to hesitate, as if uncertain about how to respond. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, thick with anticipation. Everything seemed to stretch in slow motion. Max's growls grew more guttural, his stance widening, prepared to charge again. The creature snarled back, a deep, rumbling sound that reverberated in the pit of my stomach. The standoff felt like hours, though in reality, only a few seconds passed. I could barely comprehend what was happening. I had never seen anything like this before. In all my years as a ranger, in all the wilderness I had traversed, this was beyond anything that could be explained. But one thing was crystal clear. We were in deep, and nothing was going to let us out easily. In a sudden burst of movement, the creature lunged, its claws swiping at Max with terrifying speed. Max yelped, but he was faster, dodging to the side and snapping his jaws. There was no hesitation now. The primal instincts had fully taken over. They were locked in a vicious struggle, each fighting with the desperation of knowing that only one would walk away from this battle alive. I staggered to my feet, my legs still weak from the earlier shock, but my mind was racing. I had no idea what this creature was, whether it was a cryptid, some ancient beast, or something far worse, but there was no mistaking that it wasn't just an animal. This was something with intelligence, with purpose, and we were nothing more than prey. Max was doing everything he could to hold it off, but I knew it wouldn't be enough for long. The creature's sheer size and strength were overwhelming. The odds were against us. The reality of the situation began to sink in with a cold, bitter clarity. My team, the mission, everything I had been sent here to accomplish, all of it felt irrelevant now. This wasn't some isolated beast that could be tracked and neutralized. This was a force of nature, something beyond our understanding or control, and we were at its mercy. As I watched Max dart to and fro, evading another swipe, I realized something even more terrifying. The creature wasn't just hunting us. It was toying with us. There was no urgency in its attacks, no real rush to end the struggle. It seemed to relish the game, the hunt, savoring each moment as if it were its right. It was the predator, we were the prey, and it was playing with its food. The horror of that thought paralyzed me for a moment. I couldn't stand by any longer. Max's bravery was inspiring, but he couldn't do this alone. I had to help him. With shaky hands, I lifted my rifle, aiming as best as I could. The fog had thickened again, swirling around us, but I could still see the outlines of the creature and Max's silhouette against the pale mist. I fired once, twice, but each shot missed, either due to the fog or my shaking hands. My pulse thundered in my ears, and the reality of my failure crushed down on me. Max, as if sensing my helplessness, turned to look at me for the briefest of seconds. There was something in his eyes, fierce determination, a silent plea. It was as if he knew I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I wasn't just fighting for the mission. I was fighting for him, for us, for the life that we could still have if we made it out alive. The creature, however, was relentless. It charged again, claws extended, jaws snapping with a terrifying shriek. Max dodged, but not fast enough. The creature's claws raked across his side, sending him crashing into the ground with a guttural yelp of pain. My heart stopped. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Max, the dog I had trusted, the one who had been my companion through thick and thin, was down. Blood pooled around him, staining the earth. The creature didn't stop, didn't care. It towered over him, ready to finish what it had started. I felt my body surge with a new kind of anger, fury, desperation. There was no choice now. I had to fight back. With every ounce of strength I had left, I threw myself at the creature. My rifle was still in my hand, but I had no time to aim. I raised it above my head and swung it with every bit of rage that filled me. The gun hit the creature with a sickening crack, and for a moment, I thought I had succeeded, until the creature swung its massive arm in retaliation. I was sent sprawling backward, my ribs screaming in agony as I hit the ground. My vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went dark. But through the haze, I could still hear Max. He was still alive, still fighting. In a daze, I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pushing me forward despite the pain. This time, I didn't hesitate. I had one last shot, one chance to end it. I couldn't fail. I aimed, took a breath, and fired. The shot rang out, slicing through the thick fog. The creature roared in pain. It recoiled, swiping at its chest where I had hit it. The mist around us seemed to thicken, and in that moment, I saw the creature's eyes narrow. There was something in them, something I had missed before. A cold, calculating intelligence. The creature was no longer the mindless beast it had seemed to be. It was enraged, its patience running out. And in that rage, it became more dangerous than I could have ever anticipated. But for all its fury, it knew the odds. It knew it had been wounded, and it was no longer the predator. It was the cornered animal. As it turned to flee, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The creature was retreating, disappearing back into the fog. But I couldn't relax. Not yet. Max was still down, and there was no telling if we were truly safe. I staggered toward him, fear rising in my chest once again. He looked up at me, weakly wagging his tail. He was alive, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself a small breath of relief. We had survived, but the question still lingered in my mind. What would happen next? There was no going back now. The mountain, the creature, and whatever secrets it held would stay with us forever. The days following our encounter on Mount Rainier were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and unease. Max and I were both physically battered, but the emotional toll was far heavier. We had barely escaped the clutches of something that defied all reason, something ancient, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable. The fog had cleared, but our minds remained clouded with unanswered questions. As the weeks passed, I found myself reflecting on what had truly happened up there, and what it had all meant for both of us. At first, I couldn't shake the sense of guilt. Max had taken the brunt of the creature's attacks, and while I had fought fiercely alongside him, the truth was that if I hadn't gotten distracted, if I hadn't hesitated in that critical moment, maybe we wouldn't have been injured in the first place. Every scratch, every bruise felt like my responsibility, a constant reminder that I had failed to protect him in the way a ranger should protect his companion. My thoughts spiraled, and the weight of the failure threatened to crush me. Max, however, was the one who seemed to bounce back the quickest. Dogs have an incredible way of healing, both physically and emotionally, and it wasn't long before he was once again by my side, his energy and loyalty unwavering. His resilience reminded me of why I had become a ranger in the first place, not just to protect the land, but to learn from it. Max had already forgiven me in the purest way that only a dog could. Now, it was time for me to forgive myself. The journey back to the base camp was grueling, and every step felt like a battle, both physical and psychological. We had no answers about what we had faced, no idea how to explain the unexplainable. The government hadn't sent us on this mission with any real understanding of what we were getting into. They hadn't anticipated that something as strange as what we encountered would exist. There were whispers, of course, rumors about cryptids, supernatural forces, and ancient evils lurking in the wilderness, but I had always dismissed them as the stuff of campfire tales. Now, standing on the precipice of that unknown, I couldn't ignore the reality any longer. As we trudged through the dense forest, I began to wonder about the creature itself. What was it? What had driven it to attack? In that moment, I realized that my old mindset of simply eliminating the threat wasn't going to be enough. We had been sent there to kill a creature without knowing anything about it, and yet we were still standing. Maybe it wasn't about killing it. Maybe the answer wasn't violence, but understanding. If we were ever going to truly make peace with what happened, we needed to stop seeing it as a mere adversary to be vanquished. One day, as we sat on a rocky outcrop, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself deep in thought. The land around us was breathtaking in its quiet beauty, the untouched wilderness seemingly oblivious to the chaos we had brought with us. I could hear the distant call of an owl, the rustling of trees in the wind, the soft crunch of Max's paws in the underbrush. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful for the horror that had unfolded here just days before. In that moment, I realized how much the experience had changed me. I was no longer just a ranger on a mission, a soldier with orders to follow. The wilderness had always been my home, but now it was something far more profound. I had seen the darker side of nature, the raw, untamed power that could never be fully understood or controlled. And instead of feeling fear, I felt a sense of awe. I had been humbled in a way I hadn't anticipated, and for the first time, I began to see my work not just as a job, but as a responsibility, a duty to preserve the balance of this land and its mysteries, even the ones that terrified me. Max's recovery was slow but steady. Every day, I saw the fire return to his eyes, the same fierce loyalty that had kept him by my side all those years. In a way, his resilience became my guiding light. I had faced something monstrous, and yet I was still here. I had faced fear and doubt, and while I couldn't shake the scars, both physical and emotional, I was learning to move forward. Just like Max, I had to heal, and that healing would come not through running from the past, but through confronting it. The memories of that day on Mount Rainier would always haunt me. The creature, the violence, the terror, it was all part of my journey now, a story that would live with me forever. But I had learned something valuable. Growth didn't always come from victory. Sometimes it came from surviving, from enduring the impossible and continuing to move forward. One afternoon, a few weeks after our return to civilization, I sat in my small cabin, cleaning my gear and organizing notes I had taken during our mission. Max lay curled up beside me, his breathing steady and calm. As I flipped through the pages of my journal, I found myself writing not about the monster we had faced, but about the land, about the mountains, the trees, the wildlife, and the lessons they had taught me. There was no way I could undo the terror I had witnessed, no way I could erase the uncertainty that had become a part of my every waking moment. But I could channel it into something that mattered. This journey had shown me that there was more to the wilderness than just danger. There was beauty, fragility, and a deeper connection that I had taken for granted. The true challenge wasn't in vanquishing the unknown, but in understanding it and learning from it. I wasn't the same person I had been before the mission, and neither was Max. We had both been changed by the experience, but in a way, it had made us stronger. We had faced the unimaginable, and we had come out the other side not unscathed, but more resilient, more aware of our place in the world. As I packed my gear for the next assignment, a renewed sense of purpose filled me. I had seen the darkness of the world, but I had also seen the light. And with that, I knew I could face whatever came next, because true growth didn't lie in avoiding the challenges, but in overcoming them with everything you had. As the days passed since our harrowing escape from the creature on Mount Rainier, I couldn't shake the feeling that our battle was far from over. The government, while content to send us back with little more than a vague directive and some superficial medical treatment, hadn't really prepared us for what we'd encountered. I couldn't shake the thought that if we didn't act soon, there was a greater danger lurking, one far more dangerous than the physical threat we had narrowly escaped. The thing we had faced up there was a reminder that there was something much darker out there, something that had survived centuries hidden in the wilderness. Max had begun to recover physically, but the mental scars, both for him and for me, were still fresh. There were nights when I awoke, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced the creature had returned. Its glowing eyes, its unnatural strength, it wasn't something I could easily forget. I hadn't spoken about it with anyone other than Max, and even then, words seemed inadequate. How do you explain something so extraordinary to people who will never truly understand? As I sat in my cabin, surrounded by notes and equipment, the weight of the situation began to settle on me. I realized that we had been far too unprepared when we arrived at Mount Rainier. We hadn't known what we were walking into. The government had failed us, and now we were left to clean up the mess alone. If the creature was still out there, and I had no doubt that it was, we needed a better plan. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding what we were dealing with. It was about ensuring that whatever this thing was, it never hurt anyone again. I packed up my gear carefully, mentally preparing for the mission ahead. Max, loyal as ever, stayed close, his eyes alert, as though he too sensed the weight of what was to come. It was strange. I had always relied on my training, my instincts, and the wisdom gained from years of working in the wilderness. But now those instincts felt inadequate, like they weren't enough to face the unknown horror I had encountered. I went over my notes, recalling every detail from our last encounter. I had documented the creature's size, its strength, the way it seemed to move with an eerie, almost unnatural grace. Its eyes, those glowing predatory eyes, haunted me. No animal I had ever studied had such a gaze. No predator I had encountered had ever been quite so methodical, so calculating. It wasn't just hunting, it was toying with us, enjoying the terror it invoked. This wasn't just an animal or cryptid, it was something far more insidious. Max was starting to show signs of agitation again, and I knew it wasn't from physical pain. There was something in the air, an unease, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't ignore. He'd sensed it too, the same pull, the same forewarning that had driven us to act before. We weren't going to just sit back this time and wait to be attacked again. We were going to confront it head-on. But we couldn't go in blind. I began researching every known creature, every cryptid, every ancient legend tied to the mountains. The name Skookum kept coming up, a creature from indigenous folklore, said to be a spirit of the forest, a guardian or avenger that could take many forms. It was said to be elusive and incredibly dangerous, hunting humans who ventured too far into its territory. The connection seemed too strong to ignore. Could this be the thing we had encountered? If so, we had no idea how to stop it. I reached out to a colleague in the field, someone who had a deeper understanding of indigenous stories and creatures tied to the wilderness. He was skeptical at first, dismissing the idea as superstition. But when I described the encounter in more detail, he stopped. He agreed to help me, though he warned me that knowledge alone wouldn't protect us. We'd need something more, something practical. In preparation for our return, we gathered specialized equipment, high-powered rifles, thermal imaging cameras, and a few tools that would help track the creature's movements. I couldn't believe I was going back to face the unknown, but deep down, I knew it was necessary. We couldn't let the creature continue to haunt the mountains, preying on those who dared to venture into its domain. The day before we left, I sat with Max and reflected on everything that had happened. The last few weeks had been difficult, mentally draining, physically exhausting, but it had also sparked something inside of me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about confronting an ancient force and understanding the truth behind what we had encountered. The stakes were higher now. I felt a sense of responsibility, not just to myself or Max, but to everyone who could potentially be hurt if we didn't put an end to whatever this creature was. I had taken an oath to protect the land and its inhabitants, and I had failed in that duty once. I couldn't fail again. Max, his tail wagging lightly, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just my companion, he was my partner, my ally in this strange and dangerous journey. We were in this together, and we were going to see it through to the end. I spent the rest of the evening preparing myself mentally for what was to come. We would return to Mount Rainier, but this time we would do it on our terms. We would face whatever was lurking in the shadows, armed with more than just guns and gear. We had learned the hard way that knowledge, preparation, and respect for the unknown were just as important. As I looked out the window one last time before turning in for the night, I felt a chill run down my spine. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks cutting sharply into the darkening sky. Tomorrow, we would set out again, and this time we would find answers. The air was thick with tension as Max and I made our way back toward the dense forest of Mount Rainier. Every step seemed heavier than the last, every crunch of leaves beneath our boots echoing louder in the stillness. The weight of the unknown pressed on my shoulders, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just another trip into the wilderness. It was the culmination of everything we had learned, everything we had fought through. This was the moment we would face whatever had haunted these mountains. We moved cautiously, using the thermal imaging equipment to scan the surroundings. The landscape had an eerie quietness to it, a stillness that sent a shiver down my spine. The creatures we had studied and protected over the years weren't like this. This wasn't natural. The very forest seemed to be holding its breath, as though it was aware of the darkness lurking beneath its surface. Max's hackles were raised, his eyes darting nervously around. He was on edge, and I couldn't blame him. We had both seen what this thing was capable of, and no amount of preparation could fully ease the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. As we pressed deeper into the forest, the temperature dropped, and a heavy fog began to roll in, swallowing the landscape. It was as if the world around us was becoming suffocated, consumed by something sinister. We had been walking for hours when the first sign appeared, an unmistakable scent, foul and rancid, like something decaying in the wet earth. It was the same smell we had encountered the last time, right before the creature appeared. My pulse quickened. Max growled low in his throat, and his stance grew tense, his ears flicking back. The presence of the creature was near, and I could feel it in my bones. "Stay close, Max," I whispered, though I knew he didn't need reminding. He had already positioned himself slightly ahead, ever watchful, his instincts sharp as ever. I held my breath as I scanned the area, gripping the rifle tightly in my hands. The fog made it difficult to see, but I could hear movement, something large, something heavy, crashing through the underbrush. It was close, too close. Suddenly, a massive shadow darted through the mist to my left. My heart skipped a beat. The creature was here. Before I could react, the ground beneath us seemed to shake as something enormous surged from the darkness. I barely had time to raise my rifle before the creature lunged, a blur of muscle and rage. Its eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, were fixed on me with terrifying precision. Its form was massive, more massive than I had remembered. Fur rippled like a dark wave along its body, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. It was no longer just a hunter. It had become something more, a force of nature, a nightmare given form. I fired, the sound of the shot deafening in the thick silence of the fog, but the creature was already moving, faster than I could have imagined. The bullet grazed its side, but it didn't flinch. Instead, it snarled, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The sheer power in that noise was enough to rattle me to my core. Max barked and lunged at the creature, his fur flying as he tried to distract it. The creature spun, swatting him aside with a force that sent him tumbling through the underbrush. I screamed his name, but he quickly recovered, growling fiercely as he regrouped. My heart pounded in my chest as I saw Max stand again. There was no time to waste. This was our chance to end this. I aimed for the creature's head, the only vulnerable spot I had observed during our previous encounter, and fired again. The shot rang true, striking it square in the skull. But instead of falling, the creature let out an unearthly roar that reverberated through the trees. It wasn't hurt, it was enraged. For a moment, it seemed like everything slowed down. The creature's eyes locked with mine, and I could see the raw hatred in them. It wasn't an animal. It was something ancient, something that had survived for far too long. Its nostrils flared as it lunged at me, its claws slashing through the fog like knives. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its deadly swipe. The creature was too fast, too powerful. It was like trying to fight a storm, and I was nothing but a leaf in its path. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Max was at my side again, more determined than ever, his teeth bared. He wasn't going to let this thing take me down. I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. We were outmatched. This thing, whatever it was beyond anything I had ever faced. But then I remembered the one piece of knowledge we had yet to use. There was a weakness. A legend told by the indigenous tribes of the area. They said the creature could be bound by fire. With no time to hesitate, I grabbed the flare gun from my belt and fired into the air. The flare shot into the sky, illuminating the night for a brief moment. The creature recoiled at the light, snarling in pain as the flames caught the tip of the flare. It howled in fury as the fire spread across its fur, searing its flesh. For a brief moment, the creature faltered. It was disoriented, its movements slower, its howls turning into a screech of agony. I took the chance, aiming my rifle once more and firing. The bullet struck deep into its chest. The creature staggered back, its body collapsing onto the ground with a sickening thud. Max and I stood there, breathless, watching the creature writhe in its final moments. The once menacing form seemed to shrink before us, the fires slowly consuming it. We had done it. We had finally defeated the beast. But as I stood there, the weight of the moment hit me. The creature was gone, but the truth of what it had been, the darkness that had lingered for so long, remained. What we had faced wasn't just a threat to us. It was a warning, a reminder of the untamed forces that still existed in the world, waiting in the shadows. Max nudged me, his fur singed but his spirit unbroken. I knelt beside him, my hand resting on his head. The battle was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far larger than either of us could comprehend. As the smoke from the fire faded into the fog, I couldn't help but wonder, what else was out there, hiding in the wilderness, waiting for its turn to rise? As I stood in the aftermath, the heavy silence enveloping the forest, the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. The creature, whatever it had been, was gone, its fiery demise marking the end of an unimaginable battle. Yet, as the fog rolled in and the night stretched long, I couldn't shake the unease that had gripped my chest since that first encounter. We had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. Max and I stood there in the clearing, the smoke from the creature's body dissipating slowly into the cool night air. The landscape around us felt strangely quiet, as if it, too, was trying to process what had just happened. The distant calls of nocturnal creatures, once so familiar, now seemed eerily absent. It was a rare moment of stillness, and I knew it wasn't just the absence of sound that made it unsettling. It was the realization that the world we thought we understood was far more dangerous and unknowable than we had ever imagined. The creature was only one of many threats hidden within the vast wilderness of places like Mount Rainier and the Alaskan tundra. It wasn't a fluke, a one-off monster that had wandered into our path. No, this was a part of something larger. There was a deep, ancient force at play here, one that was older than human understanding, lurking in the darkest corners of the earth. We had seen it before, in the way the land shifted, in the way the animals behaved, and now, in the creature that had nearly killed us. Max nudged me again, his fur singed but his gaze steady, as if to say that we had done what we could, but there was more work ahead. His loyalty, his bravery, had been the key to surviving that night, and I knew that without him, we might not have made it out. As we stood together in the aftermath of our victory, I couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude for my loyal companion, but also a creeping fear. What had we really destroyed? And had we truly eradicated all traces of whatever malevolent force had been at work? I couldn't dismiss the fact that I had only scratched the surface. The creature was dead, but what about the rest of its kind? What else lay hidden in these mountains, waiting to be uncovered? Could something even worse still be out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for its turn to emerge? As the night stretched on and the reality of what we'd just faced began to sink in, I realized that this would not be my last encounter with such terror. The world was vast, untamed, and unknowable. There were still dark places on this earth, places where humanity was not welcome, where the rules of nature as we knew them no longer applied. The creature we had faced was a reminder that nature still held secrets too powerful for us to fully understand. We had been naive to think that we had mastered the wild, to think that our knowledge could protect us from everything. But we hadn't mastered it, we had merely survived. As the first rays of sunlight began to break through the horizon, casting light on the smoldering remnants of the creature's body, I knew that I couldn't walk away from this experience unchanged. My purpose had shifted. I wasn't just a guardian of the forest anymore. I was a protector of something much deeper, something much darker. The battle was over, but the fight was far from finished. The wilderness was alive, and I was beginning to realize that it had secrets yet to be revealed. The terror of that night would stay with me, a constant reminder that in the wilds of the world, there are things that we are not meant to understand. And while we may win battles, the war against the unknown is one that will never truly be over. The months passed, but the memory of that night lingered, haunting every step I took in the wild. I returned to my work, but something inside me had shifted. I couldn't help but wonder how many other creatures, or forces, lay hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Alaskan wilderness had revealed its true face, and I had seen a side of nature that few ever would. As I watched the seasons change, I knew one thing for certain. The battle between man and the untamed world was far from over, and I would be ready. If you've ever felt the call of the wild, the thrill of venturing into the unknown, remember this. Some places hold secrets better left uncovered. The Alaskan wilderness is not for the faint of heart. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of the unknown. For those brave enough to face it, the wild rewards only the prepared and the wise. If you're ready to uncover the hidden truths that nature has to offer, then embrace the adventure, but tread carefully. You never know what might be lurking just beyond your reach.